Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Suzman, the CEO of the Gates Foundation. Mark, it's great to have you here at Devex World.
Great. Thank you for having me. Sorry it's not in person.
Yeah, I know. I look forward to the day when we'll be doing this in person, but I can't think of a time I'd rather talk to you. I mean, there's so much happening in the world now that you and the foundation are right at the forefront of. And maybe we can just get to probably the biggest issue on people's mind, which is around the vaccine. Uh, this pandemic has kind of exposed the inequalities that exist in the world in a really stark way, and the vaccine could end up being one of those moments where we see how unequal the world is, or maybe it's an equalizing moment. And it kind of this is what I want to put to you: will we be seeing a picture of people in the richest countries in the world getting that shot in their arm this month, next month, fairly soon, and people in the lowest income countries waiting a year or two? How do you expect this to actually happen, given the key role you and the foundation are playing in trying to ensure everyone in the world gets access to a vaccine?
Yeah, well, that is in many ways one of many multi-billion dollar questions that the world is facing right now. As you say, the pandemic has not just exposed, but really exacerbated a wide range of inequalities, both within economies and across economies. And that's been hugely challenging. The setbacks that the developing world has faced across a wide range of anything, health, education, economics, have been huge. And it's absolutely essential that we can get, quote unquote, back to normal, although it will be a new normal as quickly as possible. And that requires an equitable vaccine rollout to the developing world at the same time as the developed world. Currently, we are not on track to have that. That while there is a very important multilateral effort that we are part of, the COVAX initiative, which is designed to try and raise in a cooperative multilateral framework a pool of resources to help procure for poorer countries at the same time as wealthier countries vaccines. We also have a spate of bilateral deals by wealthier countries with the different vaccine manufacturers. And currently, only two have gone through the full regulatory trials and have submitted their things for regulatory approval. Those are the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna ones, and the UK MHRA authorities have approved the first for rollout shortly. But there's a long way to go to be able to make that both scalable in the billions of doses we need and equitable. Is it going to come to those who need it across the world in 2021 at the same time? Or are we going to be in a 2 or 3 phase world where developing countries lag far behind? And we don't know the answer to that question, but we believe strongly at the Gates Foundation that it's essential we don't make it the second part.
Yeah, and I know you're working hard to avoid that real possibility. And I just wonder, what are you focused on? There's the money component, of course. COVAX has raised a few $billions, but there's still a huge gap. But is that the key focus, or are we going to find bottlenecks in the vials or in testing or in other elements of the supply chain? You mentioned the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which require very deep freeze facilities. What are you focused on in trying to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where a vaccine is not available in these countries?
Well, we're focused on the full range. And actually, today we're announcing an additional $250 million contribution to our COVID response, which actually brings our total response over the course of the year to well over 1.5 billion. And that is really going to be designed to look at two things. One is the sort of finalizing what we call the upstream investments, the continued thing to research and development and the regulatory approval, but also heavily looking at the downstream. What are the things you need in place? What are the supply chains, the logistical thing, the training that's going to be needed for health workers, the kind of certificates you're going to need to be able to check if people are vaccinated. Currently, everything needs to be a 2-dose vaccine rather than, we're hoping one of the potential vaccines might be 1 dose, but everything currently is 2-dose, which means you really have to track who's had their first dose. Are they coming back for their second dose? Do you have enough supplies to make sure that happens reasonably? And that also, as I say, depends a lot on the different vaccines used. Of the two you cited, Both of them need cold chain. The BioNTech Pfizer one actually needs what's called ultra cold chain. It needs to be down at minus 70 degrees Celsius, which is much more challenging to do, but not impossible. The Ebola vaccine, which we successfully rolled out in West Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo, has a similar constraint. And we have portable, vaccine boxes and others that are able to do that even in low resource settings, but it makes it more difficult and expensive. So our work is really focused on all of the above. You need to both try and identify and scale up the production of vaccines, and ideally vaccines that are going to be able to be manufactured more cheaply and more efficiently than these new mRNA vaccines, which are a little bit more complex, at least in the early stages. And then how do we get that distribution and that very complex logistical supply chain downstream? And then on top of that, we need to deal with the wider issues of vaccine acceptance, potential vaccine hesitancy, how are publics going to approach this? What are the ways in which you provide the right technical advice to governments on how they sequence the rollout of vaccines? So, the word unprecedented has been used a lot in the last year. This going forward will be hopefully in a good way, but it's an unprecedented challenge that the world faces to successfully roll this out.
And it's going to test the systems that, among others, the Gates Foundation has set up. I mean, you're in this unique position of being a founder of GAVI, of CEPI, of the institutions that, and a major funder of the WHO, of the institutions really that are required for this pandemic response. And I wonder how you think about your position as a private institution, yet with all this expertise. And here you're talking about the massive funds you're providing for the COVID response. How do you think about what you take on yourselves, what you sort of use your advocacy to push others to do, and where the funding you're putting in kind of fits in the broader, more global picture around the pandemic response?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that we, look at and scrutinize all the time, because for all the work we do, the long-term, infrastructure support delivery has to be done through, public institutions, even if they're enabling private delivery at some point. So that needs to be national governments, that needs to be the big multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization, like GAVI, like CEPI. So our funding can be catalytic in that. Our technical expertise can help accelerate some things. We can take some bigger risks that sometimes governments find more challenging, to experiment with different kinds of diagnostics or tests, which might be difficult to use. But we cannot be, and philanthropy in no stage can be, a long-term solution. We're a stopgap, we're an accelerator, we're a catalyst. And one of the big tests for the world will be whether it does step up in the next year, both with the scale of resources, because you asked about resources up front, and while there are many bottlenecks, money is the first bottleneck. You first do need to raise the resources to purchase and procure these vaccines, and indeed other things, still diagnostics and treatments at scale. And then we need the resources to actually build and strengthen the infrastructure so that nothing like this happens again. The world should be investing much more in global R&D, in a stronger surveillance infrastructure to sort of monitor and check for potential new pathogens, a stronger infrastructure that's able to roll out and respond to this in real time. And ideally, it's a both and, that we're building an infrastructure that's not just about responding to this pandemic and preparing for the next one, but infrastructure that's actually going to enable regular, stronger primary healthcare, secondary healthcare in low resource settings and high resource settings. And that's challenging, but I think eminently doable and is a top priority.
So does that mean we should be expecting to see kind of the next GAVI or the next CEPI, the next multilateral, multi-stakeholder institution get stood up with a Gates backing to try to build that infrastructure? Or do you mean more strengthening the existing institutions that are already there today?
Well, I think that's one of the things that the world needs to look at significantly. It's always challenging to build new institutions. So I think the first order is to make sure we're strengthening and resourcing the organizations we have. And all of those, WHO, CEPI, GAVI, and its role in the COVAX accelerator, remain under-resourced relative to needs. So you first want to build and those, but you're also trying to build local institutions. So To take one example, an institution which is only 3 years old, was actually created after the Ebola crisis, is the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We've been major supporters of them in their early days. They've played an absolutely essential role in the COVID response across the continent of Africa, which has actually handled the crisis relatively well, comparable to other regions. And we hope and we need to build on that. How do we strengthen that institution so we can build on that early credibility so it's able to provide the technical support, the early warning systems, because that's truly not just an African public good, that will be a global public good. What are the equivalents in Latin America and Asia? And so we hope the world will take a sort of strong look at this, and it's not, either or, do we need, different kinds of institutions, or it's really looking at the full ecosystem and saying, which bits do we want to invest in now, both to address the current challenge, make sure that, COVID hopefully gets in the rearview mirror as quickly as possible, but that's still going to take some time. But you're really building an infrastructure that leaves us much, much better prepared to deal with both future ones, but also other ongoing big health and development challenges like tuberculosis, malaria. We still haven't finally eliminated polio, although we're getting closer.
Yeah, I mean, this feels to me, and I think to many others in our field, that this is the big one, right? The pandemic, you look at the goalkeepers report that you issued this year, it's setting back global development progress significantly. We're going to see tens of millions of people pushed into extreme poverty. The pandemic itself obviously has a huge health impact, but all the after effects are massive. And here you are all over the world trying to raise funds, even just for the vaccine, and not fully succeeding there yet. And we see in the UK, the commitment to 0.7 being diminished and eroded. We see, of course, here in the US, the politicization of aid. We'll have a new Biden administration. We'll see what comes from that. I guess the question I have for you is, you're talking big about what we need, but do you think the world is ready to stand up and do it? You're in these conversations with world leaders and finance ministers. Is there an appetite to stand up and do what's required at this moment? Or where do you think it's going to come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the short answer is there is appetite, but there's not a lot of understanding. Political leaders like others are easily, or not easily, they are heavily distracted by many, many competing priorities. And their first focus is always domestic. And every single country on the planet is facing massive domestic challenges as a result of COVID fallout. And so they're thinking about rising unemployment. They're thinking about educational challenges. They're thinking about their support. And that's very appropriate. And they're just often not thinking about the global thing. So a lot of our role is actually going and knocking on doors and having Bill and Melinda call world leaders and say, look, have you thought about how important it is to actually do the both and, to invest in this global infrastructure, which really costs a fraction of what most of these countries are spending on stimulus bills and other sort of financial support to the COVID response. And that really that has a much, much bigger global payout. And we actually, the Gates Foundation, working with Eurasia, just released a set of 10 reports looking at a bunch of major economies in the Middle East, Europe, Japan, including the United States and the United Kingdom, which actually demonstrates very clearly how much economic benefit there will be to those countries if they invest in global machinery to help address COVID everywhere, some of those vaccine and other rollouts. And it's just not understood often. So if you present that information, and this will be the test and the challenge over the next 6 months, because it really will need to happen in the first part of next year. And I think we hope if we can make that case articulately, other institutions like the IMF are standing up and making the case. It's very unusual for the IMF to stand up and say, you really should invest in health in order to get long-term economic benefits. The World Bank is doing the same with some of the medical countermeasures loans it's doing. I think we're building that case, we're making it, but we haven't yet succeeded, and that will be a big, big test.
And what do you think it'll mean for the Gates Foundation itself? Of course, you can't personally fund all of this, and you're announcing today that you've now expanded your funding. You'll be at above $1.5 billion toward the COVID response. But should we expect to see a significant uptick in the Gates Foundation's own funding as a result of the crisis the world finds itself in?
Well, $1.5 billion hopefully does count as a fairly significant uptick, because the vast bulk of that, $1 billion plus of it, is of new resources that we've allocated this year. That everything we work on, whether it's agricultural development, sanitation, HIV, TB, and malaria, none of those problems went away with COVID. In fact, most of them got worse. So we've been full speed ahead with all our regular work. We've been trying very hard not to take any resources away and displace them, but we are looking for complementary efforts. Are there ways we can build platforms around cold chain and vaccine delivery for COVID that actually is laying out infrastructure that we'll be able to use for other vaccination and healthcare systems going forward? Can we do smarter ways of using testing and some of the diagnostics we're doing to actually become the framework for diagnostics that are going to help us get better understanding for diseases like TB and malaria? So we're really looking at how those two things will link together. And because the world is so focused on COVID, clearly there's a lot of overlap right now. And the good news is finance ministers and heads of state are very focused on these issues in a way that traditionally might be simply the realm of education ministries or health ministries. And so I think part of our role is helping make that case. And again, we can provide some catalytic resources and technical advice, but the long-term sustainable funding needs to come from public resources, occasionally enabling and amplifying private resources as well.
Well, in the very short time that you've been the CEO of the foundation, and in the midst of a crisis like this, maybe it's hard to think about the future, but you've done a great job doing that for us today and helping to lay out what are some of the big trends and issues underlying the moment that we're in today. So thank you, Mark Suzman, for taking the time to be here and to be part of Devex World. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. It was a pleasure.